We have to move, Watch.
I know, but which way?
Follow me. Stay close.
I'm with you. We have to keep moving! Stay back! I think I found something. We need to get out of here now. We have to go. Now. What is it? No time. Just follow me.
The ship approaches. We must act now. Aye. Load the cannon and prepare. To arms.
They say the sea remembers every sin. Captain, enemy ships on the horizon. Let them come. We are ready for whatever they throw at us. You don't look like someone who belongs to war. I don't belong anywhere. My home is the shifting sea. Then stay and build something new. You can change your name, but you can't change what you are. I buried that life deep in the sand. I thought it was gone forever. The sea doesn't bury legends. I see the way you look at the ocean. You're not afraid of it. I'm afraid of losing you. Then don't push me away. They're attacking the village. We have to help them now. You thought you could escape me? I don't run anymore. This ends today, one way or another. You don't have to fight alone. If I don't fight, everyone dies. I'm not afraid of who you were. I love who you are. Priyanka Chopra in her most powerful role yet. One woman will choose her destiny. Some storms destroy you. Others reveal who you truly are.
My family, they were everything to me. My father taught me courage. My mother, that love is stronger than fear. And my little brother, he always believed I could do anything. Even when I didn't believe in myself, he was the light in the dark, the one who saw the hero in me before I ever drew a sword. I thought I was destined to be alone, a ghost of the life I lost to the waves. You don't have to fight alone anymore. And for the first time, my heart knew hope and love, but I lost them. To the sea, to battles I thought I had to fight alone. Now, I fight for them, and for the love I never thought I'd find. Destiny has called me back to the water. This summer, courage, love, and destiny collide. The BLUFF.
My family, they were everything to me. My father, he taught me to be brave, even when the world turned against us. My mother, she showed me that love is stronger than fear. And my little brother, he always believed I could do anything, even when I didn't believe in myself. But I lost them. I lost everything to the sea, to the battles I thought I had to fight alone. Every night, I hear their voices calling me back, and I know, no matter how far I run, they will always be with me, in my heart. And now, I fight for them, for their dreams, for their memory, and for the love I thought I'd never find.
The Caribbean Sea in the late 19th century was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a world of sweat and salt, of merchant ships and hidden coves, of men who lived by the blade and died by it too. But on the small, quiet island of Cayman Brac, nestled in the turquoise waters of the Western Caribbean, life moved at a different pace. The wind swept gently over limestone cliffs, the fishing boats came and went with the tide, and the people who lived there asked only for peace. It was here that Ursel Bodden had made her home. To the people of Cayman Brac, she was simply Ursel, a strong, quiet woman who kept to herself, tended her garden, raised her son with a firm and loving hand, and stood beside her husband with the steady loyalty of someone who had seen the worst the world had to offer and chosen, deliberately and consciously, to turn away from it. She was not a woman who smiled easily, but when she did, it was genuine. She was not a woman who spoke often, but when she did, her words carried weight. Nobody on the island knew her by another name. Nobody, except perhaps the sea itself, remembered the woman she used to be. Her real name was Miriam. But for years she no longer spoke of, she had been known by something far more fearsome. They had called her Bloody Mary. And that name had meant something, once. It had meant terror on the water. It had meant a ship overtaken before the crew even knew what hit them. It had meant a woman who fought like she had nothing to lose, because for a long time, she hadn't. But that was the past. And Ursel, Miriam, had locked that past away somewhere deep inside herself, in the same way that one locks a dangerous weapon in a chest and buries it where no one will find it. She had decided, years ago, that she would never open that chest again. The island life suited her. She woke before dawn, as she always had, an old habit born from years of needing to be alert at sea. She watched the sun rise over the bluff, the great limestone formation that gave the island its character, rising from the coastline like the spine of some ancient beast, riddled with caves and tunnels that only she knew in full. She had explored every inch of that bluff in her early years on the island. She knew its secrets better than anyone. She and TH had built a life together that was modest but real. TH was a good man, not a dramatic man, not a warrior, just a decent, hard-working man who loved his wife and his son and his island. He made his living on the sea, trading goods between the islands, coming home with sun-darkened skin and stories from the trade routes, and Ursel loved him with a quiet fierceness that she rarely put into words but showed in every small action. In the meals she prepared. In the way she watched for his boat from the cliff. In the way she exhaled when she saw it coming home. Their son, Isaac, was the center of their world. He had his father's easy laugh and his mother's sharp eyes. He was curious and bold and sometimes too fearless for his own good, something Ursel recognized in him with a mixture of pride and dread, because she knew where fearlessness without wisdom could lead. She taught him what she could. How to read the weather. How to move quietly. How to think before he acted. Things a mother teaches a child when she knows the world is not always kind. Elizabeth, TH's sister, rounded out their household. She was warm and practical, a grounding presence in the home, and she and Ursel had developed the kind of friendship that women build when they live close together and trust each other, not always spoken, but solid as stone. This was Ursel's life. Quiet. Ordered. Safe. But safety, she had learned long ago, is not a permanent condition. It is something you build and defend, and sometimes, no matter how well you defend it, the things you are afraid of find their way in anyway. Because Ursel had not just walked away from her old life. She had taken something with her. Something that was not hers to take. Something that the man she had escaped from would never, ever stop wanting back. Hidden deep in the caves of the bluff, sealed away behind passages that only she could navigate, was a stash of gold. Not a small amount. A fortune. The fortune of a ruthless man named Connor, her former captain, her former tormentor, taken from him in the dead of night when she finally had the chance to run. She had used part of it to establish her life on the island, spread the rest carefully so as not to draw attention, and hidden what remained so securely that she sometimes wondered if even she could find it again. She had told herself that Connor would never come. That he didn't know where she was. That enough years had passed. That she was safe. She had almost convinced herself it was true. On the morning our story begins, the sun was high and the sea was brilliant blue, and TH kissed his wife on the cheek and told her he'd be back in 3 days. He had a trading run to make, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, just the ordinary business of life on the water. Isaac watched his father's boat until it disappeared over the horizon. Ursel stood at the edge of the cliff and watched too, her eyes calm, one hand shielding her face from the sun. She didn't know it then, but she was watching the last ordinary moment her life would contain for a very long time. To understand who Ursel Bodden was, and why she fought the way she fought, you had to understand where she came from. And where she came from was a story that did not begin with peace. It began with loss. The flashbacks come in fragments throughout the film, pieces of memory that Ursel carries like scars, invisible to the eye but always present in the weight she moves with, in the way her gaze sometimes goes somewhere far away when she thinks nobody is watching. The full picture assembles slowly, like wreckage washing ashore, this piece, then that one, until finally you can see the shape of the ship that sank. She was young when her family was taken from her. The exact details are left deliberately vague, a raid, a fire, the chaos of violence, but the result was clear. A child, left alone in a world that had no particular interest in protecting her. A girl who had to learn, very quickly, that survival was not guaranteed and that no one was coming to save her. She found her way, as orphan children sometimes do, into the company of people who existed outside the law. Pirates were not romantic figures to her, they were simply the people who fed her when she was hungry and kept her alive when she might otherwise have died. She learned their ways because she had to. She became useful because being useless meant being discarded. And she turned out to be not merely useful but exceptional, quick, clever, fearless in the particular way that people are fearless when they have already lost everything that mattered. Captain Connor found her when she was still a teenager. He saw in her what others had seen, raw ability, sharpened by desperation into something genuinely dangerous, and he took her under his command. She became his most valued crew member. His most trusted lieutenant. The one he sent when he needed something done and needed it done right. Connor was not a man who led through love or loyalty. He led through fear. He was intelligent, brilliantly so, in the calculating, cold-blooded way of someone who has never allowed sentiment to interfere with ambition. He read people the way some men read maps, identifying weakness and exploiting it with surgical precision. He built his crew not out of camaraderie but out of a web of threats and dependencies so intricate that leaving seemed more dangerous than staying. For Ursel, leaving had not seemed possible for a long time. Connor had a way of making every exit look like a death sentence. He knew her history. He knew her vulnerabilities. He knew that she had nowhere else to go and no one waiting for her. And so she stayed, and she served, and she became the woman they called Bloody Mary, a name she did not choose but earned, in blood and saltwater and the dark currency of survival. But something was changing in her, slowly and then all at once. Something that Connor, for all his brilliance, failed to notice until it was too late. She had started to want a different life. It wasn't a grand philosophical awakening. It was something smaller and more fundamental, the simple, quiet wish to stop. To sleep somewhere safe. To have something to come back to. To matter to someone in a way that didn't depend on what she could do for them. She had been useful for so long that she had nearly forgotten she was also a person. Was a trader who crossed paths with Connor's ship on a route through the lower islands. He was not a pirate. He was not a fighter. He was a man with a small boat and a cargo of dry goods and an open, uncomplicated face that Ursel found almost impossible to process, because she had spent so long among people whose expressions were masks. He looked at her without calculation. He spoke to her without an angle. She thought about him for months after that chance encounter. She told herself it was nothing. Then she started planning. The gold came almost as an afterthought, or at least that's the story she told herself. Connor had accumulated it over years of raiding, and he kept the bulk of it in the hold of his flagship, catalogued and guarded. Ursel had access to that hold. She was trusted, completely and without reservation, because Connor had never once imagined that his most capable weapon would turn against him. That was his great blind spot, the crack in the armor of his perfect calculation. He understood fear as a motivator, but he underestimated the power of wanting something better. She took what she needed on a night when the tide was right and the watch was light and Connor was ashore in a port that did not need to be named. Not everything, not enough to be immediately catastrophic, though enough that he would eventually notice and know exactly who had done it. She left before dawn. She did not look back. The gold bought her passage, bought her silence, bought her the small plot of land on Cayman Brack where she and Th built their home. She tucked what remained into the caves of the BLUFF, and she tried, as hard as she had ever tried at anything, to become Ursel instead of Bloody Mary. For years, it had worked. For years, the woman with the sharp eyes and the quiet movements was just a fisherman's wife on a small Caribbean island, and nobody who looked at her would have guessed the history she carried. But history does not stay buried simply because you bury it. And Connor was a man with a very long memory and an absolute inability to let go of what he considered his. He had been looking for her. All this time, he had been looking. And now, years later, with Th's boat on the open water and the island at its most vulnerable, he had finally found what he was looking for. T.H. had been at sea for less than a day when he saw the ship. It was not unusual, on the trading routes between the Caribbean islands, to encounter other vessels. The waters were busy with commerce and communication, and a meeting at sea was generally nothing more than a wave exchanged between crews, perhaps a shouted question about weather or conditions further down the route, and then on about your business. Th had made this run dozens of times. He knew these waters. He knew the kind of ships that traveled them. This one was different. He knew it before he could have articulated why, some animal instinct, some reading of the ship's profile against the sky that sent a quiet alarm through him. The vessel was large, dark-hulled, moving with the deliberate purpose of a predator. It was not displaying the flags of a merchant company. It was not flying any identification at all. Th ordered his crew to change course. They were not fast enough. Connor's ship closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. The crew of the trading vessel barely had time to register what was happening before the boarding hooks came over the rail, before the men began coming over the side with blades and pistols, before the world collapsed into chaos and noise and the particular brutality of a well-practiced pirate assault. It was over in minutes. Th's crew, ordinary men, traders and sailors with no particular martial training, were killed with professional dispatch. They were not the objective. They were simply obstacles. Th himself was kept alive. Connor stood on the deck of Th's captured vessel and looked at the man before him with the patient, measuring gaze of someone who has already decided the outcome but is in no hurry to arrive there. He was older than Th had expected a pirate captain to be, a weathered, formidable man with cold eyes and the unhurried manner of someone who has learned that time is always on his side. He wore no particular costume of piracy, he dressed simply and practically, as a man who has nothing to prove. He told Th his name. He told Th what he wanted. He told Th that he was going to take him to Cayman Brack and that Th was going to help him get what he'd come for, or Th's death would be slow and memorable. Th was not a coward. He had a moment where he considered refusing, where he weighed defiance against consequence. But Connor read this in him before it could become action, and he made clear, in a few quiet words, that the consequence would not fall only on Th. It would fall on the island. On the people of Cayman Brack. On Th's family. Th agreed to cooperate. It was the only decision available to him. The voyage back to Cayman Brack took less than a day. Connor used the time to prepare. He was methodical in a way that spoke to long experience. He briefed his men, assigned roles, reviewed the intelligence he had gathered about the island over months of careful observation. He knew the layout of the village. He knew the approximate population. He knew the location of the BLUFF and the significance of the caves within it. He had done his homework. What he did not know, what he had never fully been able to account for, despite all his intelligence, was what Ursel would do when he arrived. He had known her for years. He had trained her, in a sense, or at least overseen her development. He understood her capabilities better than almost anyone. But understanding someone's capabilities and predicting their behavior are different things. And Ursel had changed in ways that Connor had not anticipated, because he could not conceive of the transformation she had undergone. In his mind, she was still the weapon he had shaped. He did not understand that she had spent years becoming someone entirely different. When Connor's ships appeared on the horizon off Cayman Brac, it was late afternoon. The light was golden and the sea was calm, one of those luminous Caribbean evenings that make the world look impossibly beautiful just before something terrible happens. A fisherman on the bluff saw the ships first and ran to the village with the alarm. The people of Cayman Brac had no defenses. They were not a military settlement. They had no way of knowing, in those first minutes, what the ships portended or what they wanted. Connor came ashore with a force of 20 men, not his full crew, but more than enough for a village of this size. They came in boats with their weapons visible and their manner calm, the calm of people who have done this before and expect no serious resistance. Connor himself walked at the front of the group, unhurried, his eyes moving across the village with the appraising look of a man taking inventory. The villagers were gathered at the center of the settlement before most of them understood what was happening. Connor stood before them and spoke in the even, clear voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. He told them they were not in danger, so long as they cooperated. He told them what he wanted. He told them who he was looking for. Ursel's name, her real name, Miriam, produced a visible reaction in a few of the older villagers who had lived beside her for years. Confusion, mostly. The quiet woman with the garden. The fisherman's wife. Connor watched their faces with patience. He had expected this. He knew that she had built a persona here, a cover of ordinary domesticity. It amused him, in the cold way that things amused him. He had always known, even when she was at the height of her usefulness to him, that she was playing a role. He simply had not known, until she ran, what the role was hiding. He set guards on the villagers and dispatched 3 of his best men, Scout, Chien, and Weston, to find Ursel. He had brought to the village center and kept there, visible, alive, a hostage whose survival was contingent on Ursel's cooperation. And then he waited, with the calm of a man who has all the time in the world. He did not yet know that someone had already seen his ships and begun to move. Ursel had seen the ships before they reached the shore. She had been up on the bluff, as she sometimes was in the late afternoon, not for any specific purpose, just the habit of high ground, the instinct of someone who had spent years needing to see threats before they arrived. The bluff gave her a view of the sea in nearly every direction. She had always told herself she went there for the view. She had always known, somewhere beneath that story, that she went there to watch. When she saw the dark-hulled ships, she knew. She did not need to see the flag, there was no flag. She did not need to see the faces, they were too far away. She knew from the ships themselves, from their profile, from the way they moved. She had sailed on vessels like that. She had stood on decks like those and watched other people's worlds end. She felt fear first, the cold, clarifying kind that drops through the body like ice water and sharpens everything. Then she felt something she had not felt in years, something she had hoped, genuinely and desperately hoped, she was done feeling, the old readiness. The combat alertness. The switch that flipped inside her when violence was coming and survival required complete and immediate presence. Bloody Mary, waking up. She moved. Down from the bluff by the back route, through the brush and over the rocks the way she had 100 times in her early years on the island, before she had convinced herself she didn't need to know escape routes anymore. She went to the house first, quickly, knowing she had minutes at most before Connor's men reached the village. She grabbed what she needed. Not much. She had always kept a bag packed, in the back of a closet, in the same way she had always known the cave routes. Not because she planned to use it. Just because. Isaac was in the yard. She called him to her with a tone that made him come immediately, without questions. There was something in her voice that he had never heard before, or perhaps had heard echoes of without understanding what it meant, and it made him understand instinctively that this was not the time for curiosity. Elizabeth was in the kitchen. Ursel told her, in the same flat urgent voice, that they needed to go. Now. Elizabeth looked at her, looked at the expression on her face, and did not ask why. The three of them moved out of the village before Connor's boats had fully landed. Ursel took them by a route that bypassed the main path, through undergrowth and over terrain that was difficult for people who didn't know it, easy for someone who had walked it in the dark. She moved quickly but quietly, and she kept Isaac and Elizabeth moving with her, and she said almost nothing. She led them to the caves. The cave system beneath and within the bluff was extensive, a network of passages carved by water over centuries, some wide enough to walk through comfortably, others narrow enough to require turning sideways and squeezing through, some leading to the sea and some leading to dead ends and some leading, if you knew the way, to the hidden chamber where she had stashed Connor's gold years ago. The entrances were not obvious. You had to know where to look. To a stranger, the bluff's face was simply rock. Ursel knew every passage. She had mapped them in her head during those first years on the island, when the paranoia of having taken from Connor was still fresh and she could not sleep unless she knew, exactly and specifically, where she would run if she had to and how she would survive when she got there. She had stocked the inner chambers with supplies, enough to last weeks. She had thought through every contingency. She had hoped, badly, that she would never need any of it. Inside the caves, away from the light and the noise of the village, she stopped and made herself breathe. Isaac watched her with wide, steady eyes. Elizabeth held herself very still. Both of them waiting. "His name is Connor," Ursel said. Her voice was flat and controlled. She looked at Isaac as she spoke, not at Elizabeth, who was an adult and could absorb this more easily, but at her son, because he needed to understand. "He was my captain, a long time ago. Before I came here. I took something from him when I left, and he has come to take it back." Isaac listened. He was old enough to understand the shape of what she was telling him, young enough that the full weight of it hadn't landed yet. "The gold," he said. He had known about the gold, vaguely, she had told him, over the years, enough that he could piece it together. Not everything, but enough. "The gold," she confirmed. "And he wants to hurt me. The gold is the reason he found us, but it is not the only reason he came." She began working as she talked. The cave tunnels leading toward the bluff's surface passages needed to be made difficult to navigate, not impossible, but dangerous for someone who didn't know the terrain. She had, over the years, prepared for exactly this scenario without fully admitting to herself that she was doing so. There were trip mechanisms in place at key choke points. There were false passages that led to dead ends with no easy return. There were places where the ceiling was low and the floor was treacherous, places that a careful person with a torch could manage but that a group of men moving quickly in the dark would find disorienting at best and lethal at worst. She worked quickly and methodically, activating the things she had put in place, checking the things she needed to check. Elizabeth helped where she could. Isaac, to his credit, followed instructions without argument and without panic. When she had done what she could, she sat down with Isaac and took his face in her hands and looked at him. "If something happens to me," she said, "you know where the boat is. The small one, in the second sea cave. You take Elizabeth and you sail east. You keep sailing east until you see the British regiment ships. You do not stop for anyone. You do not go back for anything." Isaac's jaw tightened. "What about you?" "I'm going to go talk to Connor," she said. "I'm going to try to end this without more people getting hurt." What she didn't say, what she could not say to her son, was that she already knew, in the bone-deep way of someone who has known a person like Connor intimately, that talking would not be enough. That Connor had not come all this way, across all these years, simply to accept a negotiation and sail home. That the gold was an excuse. That what he had really come for was something she could not give him. He had come for her. While Connor waited in the village with the hostages and the patience of a man who had planned everything down to the last detail, his 3 best men, Scout, Chien, and Weston, spread out across the island to find Ursel. They were experienced. They were capable. They were not the kind of men who panicked or made elementary mistakes. Connor did not send amateurs on tasks like this. These 3 had handled difficult extractions before, had hunted people in environments that were not their own, had tracked targets through jungle and city alike. They were confident, and their confidence was not unjustified. But they were not on familiar ground, and Ursel was. The difference between hunting someone who knows the terrain and hunting someone who doesn't is almost impossible to overstate. A stranger in unfamiliar territory is constantly spending cognitive energy on the environment itself, reading the ground, checking the light, listening for sounds whose meaning they don't fully understand. The person who belongs there has all of that processed automatically, leaving their full attention free for the actual situation at hand. Ursel had walked this island for years. Every path, every outcrop, every place where the ground was soft and would take a footprint, or where the brush would conceal a person, or where the wind came from a certain direction and would carry sound. She knew it all. Scout moved through the eastern end of the island with the careful, methodical sweep of a trained tracker. He was the best of the 3, patient, observant, not easily fooled. He found traces of passage, disturbed brush, a partial footprint in soft earth near a creek, the subtle signs that several people had moved through an area recently and quickly. He followed the trail with professional competence, calling occasionally to Chien, who was working a parallel route 50 yards to his south. He did not find Ursel. Ursel found him. She had circled back from the cave entrance, moving through a route that Scout's sweep had not yet covered, and she came at him from an angle he had not anticipated, not because she was invisible but because he was focused on the trail ahead and she came from the side. She was not fully committed to a confrontation, not yet. She was assessing. How many, how close, how aware of her actual position. She needed intelligence before she could act. What she saw was not reassuring. 3 men, all armed, experienced in their movement, covering ground systematically. They would reach the cave area in a matter of hours if they were not stopped or redirected. The caves had advantages, but those advantages required that she control the engagement, not react to it. She needed to set the terms. She pulled back. She went around the long way, through terrain she knew would be difficult for anyone without her knowledge of it, and she began to prepare. The first trap she laid was not lethal. She had made a decision, in those hard minutes of clarity in the cave, that she would not kill unless she had to. Not because killing troubled her in principle, she had long since moved past that kind of innocence. But because dead men could not tell Connor she had been armed and active, and she wanted Connor uncertain of what she had available to her. Uncertainty could be a weapon, deployed correctly. She rigged a tripwire across a narrow passage between 2 outcroppings that the eastern sweep would inevitably have to cross. Not wire, she had no wire. She used what the island offered, a length of natural vine, dried hard and strong, fixed to a sapling on one side and a bent-back branch on the other, positioned at ankle height against the dark ground where it was nearly invisible. The release would snap the branch up and out, not into the person who triggered it, but away, making a sound, creating distraction, announcing that someone was active in the area. A warning, not a weapon. Then she moved further along the anticipated route and set something slightly more serious at the second choke point, a spiked deadfall, constructed from a rock she found balanced precariously on a natural ledge, positioned to come down across the path if the supporting vine was cut, which it would be, if anyone tried to remove the tripwire rather than simply walking into it. Not necessarily lethal, depending on positioning, but serious enough to make someone very careful. These preparations took time that she didn't have in abundance. But she also knew that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in this kind of situation compounded rapidly. Chien was the one who hit the first tripwire. He was moving quickly, more quickly than the terrain warranted, trying to close ground before the light got worse. He hit the vine at mid-step, felt it catch, had half a second of confusion before the branch snapped. He threw himself sideways by pure reflex, good reflex, well-trained, and the sound of the branch cracking rang out across the bush. Scout came to him immediately, both of them alert and still. They communicated in the minimal signals of people who have worked together for years. Weston closed from his position to the south. The three men stood in the gathering afternoon light and looked at the vine, at the trigger mechanism, at the sophistication of what had been set for them. This was not the desperate improvisation of a frightened civilian. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Scout looked at the others and said nothing, but his expression changed. He had been treating this as a search for a woman on an unfamiliar island. He was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. They moved more slowly after that. More carefully. Which was exactly what Ursel needed them to do. Because while they were slowing down and reconsidering and communicating back to Connor about what they'd found, Ursel was already moving in a completely different direction. Not away from Connor, but toward him. She had set the traps not to stop his men but to occupy them, to create noise and confusion and the impression of defensive fortification, while she herself slipped around the perimeter of the village to see what she was actually dealing with. She needed to see TH. She needed to know how many men were with Connor. She needed to see the village and the hostages and understand the exact configuration of what she was facing before she made any decisions about what to do next. She moved through the undergrowth at the edge of the village with an ease that was almost eerie, decades of practice at being invisible in plain sight, the muscle memory of 100 nighttime operations. She found a position where she could see without being seen, and she watched. TH was alive. She could see him from across the square, bound to a post near the well, his face battered but his eyes open and tracking. She held herself completely still and watched him until she was sure, yes, alive, conscious, aware. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she was clenching. Then she looked at Connor. Of having followed her trail across the Caribbean to this small island where she had tried to disappear, of demonstrating to her, and perhaps to himself, that there was nowhere she could go that he could not follow. He had come to establish, with finality and violence, that she had never escaped him and never would. The gold was the excuse. She was the destination. And this meant that no negotiation was going to work. She could give him the gold, all of it, every coin, and he would still not let TH live, would still not leave the island without making a statement that she would spend the rest of her life unable to forget. She understood this with absolute clarity as the conversation drew toward its end, and she understood also that she had always understood it, had known it since the moment she saw the ships on the horizon. She had come to negotiate anyway because she owed it to TH to try, and because the attempt gave her cover and information she needed. Connor smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that reached his eyes in a cold way, and said, "I'm going to find the gold, Miriam. And then I'm going to deal with your husband. And then you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens to people who steal from me." And in that moment, he made his move. He gestured to the man nearest TH. Ursel moved at the same time, faster than Connor had expected, because he had forgotten, or never fully accounted for, how fast she was when she needed to be. But she was not fast enough. The village square erupted into chaos. Men moved. TH cried out once. And Ursel ran, because staying meant dying, and she was not done yet. What followed was war, not the organized, flag-waving kind, but the messy, intimate kind that happens in small spaces between people who have unfinished business with each other. Connor's men fanned out across the island in force now. The pretense of a contained situation was over. He had what he needed, or thought he did, and the remaining task, in his estimation, was simply to locate Ursel and the gold before she could make either of them disappear. He sent 12 men into the eastern terrain, toward the BLUFF. He kept 8 in the village with the hostages. He came himself with 3 of his best, moving in the direction he had watched Ursel run. He did not know that she had doubled back. The house, Ursel and Th's home, built with the gold and the years and the labor of a life Ursel had constructed with her own hands, became, for a stretch of time that felt much longer than it actually was, a combat zone. Two of Connor's men came through the front door and found Ursel waiting for them. She had gone back to the house not from sentiment, not to protect a structure, which was replaceable, but because there were things she needed from it. Tools. A knife that she had kept, all these years, in a place only she knew about, at the back of a drawer in the kitchen, wrapped in cloth. A particular rope. A length of chain she had used for the garden and never thrown away. The house was full of things that were not weapons but could be made into weapons by someone with the knowledge and the ruthlessness to do so. The men who came through the door were not expecting what they found. They expected, at most, a frightened woman, someone who had tried to negotiate and failed and was now panicking. What they encountered was someone who had been waiting, specifically and deliberately, for their approach, who knew from the sound of their footsteps on the porch exactly how many of them there were and from which angle they were coming. The fight was brutal and fast and conducted largely in silence except for the sounds of impact and effort. Furniture did become a weapon, exactly as the film shows, a chair swung with both hands as a battering object, a table overturned to create obstacle and cover, a clay pot used as a projectile with enough force to stagger. Ursel had a short blade, not the knife from the drawer, which she was saving, but a kitchen blade that could be gripped and used in close quarters. She used it. One man went down hard and did not get up. The other made it out of the house and was shouting, alerting Connor's crew to her position. She was out the back before the shout had finished echoing. Outside, the island had become a different place. It was full dark now, the stars brilliant above, the trees dark shapes against a darker sky. The advantage this gave to Ursel, who knew every inch of the terrain by feel if necessary, was substantial. Connor's men were operating by torchlight and proximity, calling to each other to maintain coordination, which told Ursel exactly where they were at all times while she moved in silence. She was running a containment operation, in the terminology she had never been formally taught but had absorbed over years of practice. She could not defeat 12 men in open combat. That was not a realistic objective. What she could do was degrade their effectiveness, sow confusion, separate individuals from their group, and gradually reduce the number of people actively coordinated against her. She had done this before, in different circumstances. She had, in fact, been on the other side of it before, been the one sent to find someone who was conducting exactly this kind of campaign against a larger force. She knew how it was done. Scout was the first one she took out of the equation decisively. She found him separated from the main group, moving cautiously through a section of brush she had passed through herself an hour earlier, following traces she had deliberately left as bait. She came down on him from above, from a limestone outcrop she had climbed in the dark by feel, and the fight was brief and she did not kill him, choosing instead to leave him incapacitated and bound, unable to call out, tucked into a hollow in the rock where his colleagues would not find him quickly. Weston she encountered by accident, an unexpected mutual surprise in a grove of trees, both of them going still at the same moment in the way of two people who realize simultaneously that they are not alone. He was faster than she expected and the fight was closer than she would have liked, and she sustained her first real injury of the night, a cut along her left forearm that bled freely but was not deep. She put Weston down and moved on without stopping to assess the damage. Meanwhile, at the caves, Elizabeth and Isaac had heard the sounds of the fighting in the distance, the shouts, the crash of the house, the periodic calls of Connor's men as they swept the terrain. Isaac had wanted to go. Elizabeth had held him, physically if necessary, to the plan his mother had laid out. They stayed. They prepared. They kept the entrance as dark and unobtrusive as possible and they waited. But 3 of Connor's men had followed the trail better than Ursel had anticipated, whether by luck or by genuine skill, she wasn't certain, and they found one of the cave entrances. They went in. Isaac heard them coming before he saw them. He did what his mother had told him, He got Elizabeth and he moved deeper into the cave system, toward the secondary exit that only Ursel had told him about, the one that came out on the far side of the bluff near the sea. He moved by memory, the same way Ursel had taught him the route, step by step, the same way she had insisted he learn it not as a precaution but just because it was interesting, the way parents teach children things they hope will never matter. The three men found the cave. They did not find Isaac and Elizabeth. They found the tripwires Ursel had laid, and the darkness, and the disorienting branching passages, and one of them found the deadfall and was not seriously hurt but was badly shaken. They retreated. By midnight, Connor had lost contact with 6 of his men. He did not yet know how many of those were dead versus merely incapacitated. He was standing in the village square with the remaining 8, calculating, and he was reassessing for the first time since he arrived. He had expected this to be simple. He had expected her to run or to be captured. He had not expected this. He had forgotten something important about Bloody Mary. He had forgotten that she was very, very good at what she did. He had trained her, in a way. But he had not imagined she would use that training against him. He gave new orders. Stop the sweep. Concentrate at the bluff. He knew the gold was in the caves. He knew she would protect the gold. He would force the issue there. He didn't know yet that protecting the gold was the least of Ursel's concerns. Ursel found out about TH in the worst possible way. She had been working back toward the village, operating on the plan she had been refining all night, get close enough to Connor to understand his current positioning, assess whether TH could be extracted in the confusion, find a path to ending this without more deaths. She was cut and exhausted and running on the pure adrenaline of sustained crisis, but she was still functional, still thinking clearly, still managing the situation with the same cold competence that had made her valuable to Connor all those years ago. She came to the edge of the village and she found TH's body. She did not cry. This is important to understand. Not because she didn't feel it, she felt it in a way that was almost physical, a hollowing out, as if something structural inside her had been removed and the remaining architecture was bearing weight it was not designed for. She felt it completely. She just could not afford to feel it right now, in this place, where being still meant dying and where collapsing into grief was a luxury she did not have. She knelt beside him for exactly as long as she could. Long enough to understand that this was real, that he was gone, that the life they had built together had been taken from her by the man she had tried to leave behind. Long enough to say what she needed to say, in the silence of her own mind, without words that anyone would ever hear. Then she stood up. Something changed in her in those seconds. Something that had been held in balance, the woman who had chosen peace and built a life and tried to be someone other than who she had been, shifted. Not broke, exactly. Shifted. The chest that she had locked and buried opened up, not all the way, but enough. Bloody Mary, fully awake for the first time in years, looked out through Ursel's eyes at the island and the night and the man who had done this, and she was absolutely calm. Calm in the way of a storm that is not yet visible but is absolutely coming. She went back to the caves. She needed to see Isaac. Not because her plan required it, she knew what she had to do now, and it didn't require checking in, but because she needed to see her son's face before she did what she was about to do. She needed to look at him and know that what she was about to become, for a few hours, was in service of something that was worth it. The secondary entrance worked. She came in from the seaside and moved through the dark passages by pure memory until she heard their breathing, Elizabeth's quick, controlled breaths, Isaac's slower ones, the particular sound of two people trying to be very quiet and not entirely succeeding. She said his name softly so he would know it was her. The conversation she had with Isaac was short. She told him that his father was dead. She watched the words land, watched his face, his father's face, that easy openness, those uncomplicated features, absorb the blow and reorganize itself around the absence. She did not look away. He deserved to have her witness this with him, not flinch from it. He did not break down. He was his mother's son. She reminded him of the plan, the boat, Elizabeth, sail east, the British regiment, and she told him that the plan had not changed. If she didn't come back, he would know what to do. She did not ask him to promise her he would follow it, because she knew that asking him to promise was asking him to make a commitment he might not be able to keep, and she respected him enough not to put him in that position. She told him she loved him, which she did not say as often as she should have, and which she said now without embarrassment or ceremony, the same way you say something important when you're not sure you'll have another chance. Then she asked Elizabeth one thing: be ready, when the time came, to create a distraction. Not a big one. Just enough, for just long enough. Elizabeth, whose hands were shaking slightly but whose eyes were steady, said yes. Ursel took the knife, the one from the drawer, the one she had kept all those years, and she went back into the dark. Connor, she knew, was moving toward the bluff. He had consolidated his forces and he was coming to force the confrontation at the caves, because that was where the gold was and because he understood, correctly, that Ursel would be there to protect it. He was thinking about the gold and about her. He was not thinking about the bluff itself, about the terrain of the fight's final location, because he did not know the bluff the way she did. This was his last mistake. She moved through routes that no one else on the island could have navigated in the dark, through passages in the rock that required knowing exactly where to put your feet, through undergrowth that she had passed through so many times she knew its texture by feel, and she arrived at the top of the bluff before Connor and his men reached the base. She stood at the edge of the great limestone shelf, looking out over the dark Caribbean, and she waited. The wind came off the water and moved through her hair, and she thought about Th and about Isaac and about the girl she had been before any of this, the girl who had lost her family and survived anyway, who had found her way to this island and this life and had thought, for a long time, that she had finally outrun the world that made her. You cannot outrun what you are. She understood that now. Not as a defeat, as a fact, a neutral fact, the same way the tides are a fact and the seasons are a fact. She was Bloody Mary. She had always been Bloody Mary, even when she was Ursel, even when she was living quietly and tending her garden and watching for Th's boat. The capacity had always been there. She had chosen not to use it. Now she was choosing. Below, she could hear Connor's men beginning the climb. Connor had lit the smoke signal himself. This was the detail that demonstrated, perhaps better than anything else, the particular quality of his intelligence. The smoke signal, a fire at the top of the bluff, visible from miles at sea, was a distress signal that would bring the British Naval Regiment patrolling the regional waters. Ursel had told Isaac about it as an emergency option. If everything went wrong, if the signal fire was lit, it would bring British ships within hours. Connor had known about the signal system. He had done his intelligence well. And he understood, with the exact strategic acuity that made him formidable, that the British regiment was as much a threat to Ursel as to him. She was wanted in multiple jurisdictions, a fugitive, Bloody Mary whose history of piracy would not be forgiven by any naval authority. Calling in the British was calling in people who would arrest or kill both of them. What he intended, by lighting the signal himself, was to force a resolution before the British arrived. He wanted to kill Ursel, publicly, demonstrably, so that when the ships arrived, he could present himself as the man who had cornered and dispatched a notorious pirate. A bounty hunter's story, not a pirate's story. He had thought it through carefully. He had an identity he could present that would survive British scrutiny. He had papers. He had not accounted for the fact that Ursel had been thinking several steps further ahead. The climb to the top of the bluff was difficult in daylight. In the dark, following torchlight, with a woman who knew every foothold and handhold positioned above and prepared, it was something considerably worse. Connor's men came up in two groups on two different paths. He was not so foolish as to funnel everyone into a single approach, and both groups encountered her handiwork. The first group found the path blocked by a deadfall of loose limestone that had not been loose before, that Ursel had spent an hour preparing while she waited. The rocks came down as they reached the steepest section of the approach, and 2 men went down with them, not dead, but injured enough to be out of the fight. The others retreated to find another route. The second group reached the top. Connor was with the second group, and he arrived on the limestone shelf at the top of the bluff in the light of the signal fire he himself had lit, a brilliant, crackling beacon that threw orange light across the rock and the sea below, and he found Ursel standing at the far edge, waiting for him. He sent his men wide, flanking positions, and he walked toward her himself. The signal fire was between them for a moment, and he walked around it, and they faced each other on the top of the bluff with the Caribbean below and the stars above and the fire throwing their shadows long across the rock. This was different from the negotiation in the village square. There was nothing to negotiate now. They both understood this. The formalities were done. Connor drew his blade. He preferred blades, always had, a preference that Ursel had learned from watching him over years, and that she had catalogued against exactly this scenario, and he moved toward her with the unhurried confidence of a man who has had this fight before and won. He was very good. This was something Ursel had always known and never underestimated. He was fast for his age and technically precise, and he had spent a lifetime in combat, a lifetime longer than hers. He had no sentimentality about violence, no hesitation, no residual human reluctance that could be exploited in the moment of contact. The fight was not cinematic in the sense of being balletic or beautiful. It was ugly and close, and several times it seemed, from the outside, like Connor was simply going to win, that he was too fast, too strong, too technically skilled for Ursel to overcome in a straight confrontation. He hit her twice in the first 30 seconds, and she went to her knees once and came back up, and there was a moment where he had her at the edge, the actual edge. The cliff dropped to the sea below, and she was not entirely certain she was going to survive the next few seconds. What saved her was Elizabeth. From the cave exit below, the secondary entrance on the sea side, a sound. A torch, appearing briefly and then extinguishing. The sharp crack of rocks displaced by movement. Enough noise, precisely calibrated, to make Connor's eyes flick sideways for a fraction of a second, the instinct of a man assessing threat, the automatic check. A fraction of a second. Ursel moved. The knife from the drawer, the one she had kept for 11 years in the back of a kitchen drawer wrapped in cloth, the one she had taken from Connor's own ship the night she fled, the one that was his and was now hers and had been this whole time, came out of her sleeve where she had kept it hidden through the entire fight, saved for exactly this moment, and she drove it home. Connor looked down. He looked up at her. His expression in the firelight was not, quite, what she expected. It was not rage or fear exactly. It was something more like recognition. The acknowledgement of a chess player who has seen, too late, the move that was coming and understands, in retrospect, exactly how it was set up. He went to his knees on the limestone shelf. He tried to say something. The words didn't come. He fell. Ursel stood over him and breathed. The signal fire crackled behind her. The sea was dark below. The stars did not care about any of this, which was, in its way, a comfort. She looked at the man who had made her what she was, who had hunted her across years and oceans, who had taken from her, and she did not feel what she expected to feel. She had expected triumph, or relief, or the grim satisfaction of a finished thing. What she actually felt was exhausted, profoundly, completely exhausted, and underneath that, very far down, something that might eventually become grief, if she let herself get to a place where it was safe enough to feel it. She turned from Connor's body and looked out over the Caribbean. Somewhere to the east, Isaac and Elizabeth were on the small boat, sailing toward the British ships. Somewhere below, Connor's remaining men were regrouping without their captain, uncertain, leaderless, their entire operation unraveling in the way that operations do when their driving intelligence is removed. She was bleeding from multiple places. Her arm ached where she'd been cut, and there were newer injuries from the fight, bruised ribs, a split lip, a headache that she suspected was a concussion beginning to announce itself. She would deal with all of this. She looked at the signal fire and thought about whether to let it continue burning. She decided yes. The British ships would come. She would be gone before they arrived, or she wouldn't, and if she wasn't, she would deal with that problem when it arrived. She was tired of planning too far ahead. She started down the bluff. The British naval ships arrived at dawn. They found the island of Cayman Brac in the particular state that follows violence that has resolved itself, the stillness of a place where terrible things have happened and the terrible things are, for the moment, done. Connor's men, leaderless and afraid and uncertain of what had happened to their captain and to several of their colleagues, had done the only rational thing available to people in their situation. They had taken their boats and they had left. The British officers who came ashore found the villagers shaken but alive. They found evidence of a violent night, damaged structures, injuries among the population, the marks of a sustained and serious engagement. They found, on the top of the bluff, the body of a man who was eventually identified as Connor, the name on his papers, a man with a substantial history of piracy and warrant history across several jurisdictions. They found the cave system, and the hidden chamber, and the gold, most of it, what Isaac had left behind when he took the small boat east. They conducted their inquiry with the thoroughness of British naval procedure and they gathered what information they could from the traumatized villagers, who told them what they knew and did not know much. A woman who had lived here. Her husband, who was dead. An attack by pirates. They did not find Ursel. She was gone. In the period between the end of the fight on the bluff and the arrival of the British ships, those dark hours when the island was quiet and she was alone with the consequences, she had made the decision that she knew, practically, had to be made. The British would come. Her history was not something that could withstand British naval scrutiny. She was, in the eyes of maritime law, still Bloody Mary. Still wanted. Still a criminal, however far in the past that criminality lay. She left the island before dawn. She did not take the main path. She did not take anything more than she could carry. She moved the way she had always moved when she needed to disappear, quietly, in the dark, using routes that no one else would think to look. Isaac and Elizabeth had made it to the British ships. This she found out later, not immediately, but within weeks, through the networks of communication that exist along trade routes, the informal human telegraph of sailors and traders passing news between islands. Isaac had presented himself to the British officers aboard the patrol vessel with a composure that had apparently surprised them. He had a story to tell and he told it well, and he was a minor, a young man who had survived an attack on his home, and the British officers had other priorities than the complicated question of whether his mother's history made him a legal liability. He was safe. Elizabeth was safe. The gold that Isaac had taken onto the boat, the considerable portion of it, was with him. He had not, as Ursel had somewhat expected, immediately sailed for England. He had sailed to the nearest British vessel and done the pragmatic thing, and the pragmatic thing had worked. She found him, eventually. The finding took time, months of careful movement and careful communication, staying off the main routes, staying away from ports where she might be recognized, navigating the Caribbean through back channels that she knew from her years of piracy and that had not, she was glad to discover, entirely changed. The sea was still the sea. The routes were still the routes. The people who moved outside the official network still moved through the same spaces. When she found Isaac, he looked older than she expected, not older than his years, exactly, but older than when she had last seen him, which was only months ago. The particular kind of age that comes from grief and crisis and sudden responsibility. He looked at her and she looked at him and neither of them said anything for a moment, and then he came to her and she held him. She could not go back to Cayman Brac. This was understood between them, not spoken but understood. The island had been her home, genuinely her home, the only real home she had made as an adult, and it was gone. Was in the ground there, and the house was damaged, and the British had been, and even if the British had moved on, her history there was now complicated in ways that could not be uncomplicated. What came next was uncertain. This, also, was understood. She was a woman of middle age with a violent past and no particular home and a son who was adjusting to a world that had changed under him with great speed. She had the gold, some of it, and the gold was freedom in a practical sense, the ability to move and to choose and to not be dependent on the charity of others. This was not nothing. In one of their conversations, the quiet kind, the kind you have late at night when the practical talk is done and you are just sitting with each other, Isaac asked her what she was going to do. She thought about this. She thought about Cayman Brack and the garden and the cliff where she had watched for Th's boat in the late afternoon. She thought about Th himself, the uncomplicated goodness of him, the way he had looked at her without calculation on that first meeting. She thought about Connor, and about what she had done on the top of the bluff, and about whether that made her Bloody Mary again or whether it was simply something she had done because it had to be done. She was honest with herself in a way that she had not always been in her years of peaceful domesticity. She was not done with the world. The world was not done with her. She had skills that were not useful for gardening or keeping house and that were extremely useful for other things, and those skills did not disappear because she had chosen not to use them for a decade. They were part of her. They had kept her alive. They had kept Isaac alive. The question was not whether she was Bloody Mary or Ursel. She was both. She had always been both. The question was what she chose to do with what she was. The final image of the film leaves this genuinely open. Ursel on a boat, a good-sized boat, better than the small island craft she had been born on, the kind of vessel a person with resources can acquire, on open water, the Caribbean light on her face, her eyes forward. Isaac beside her, growing into himself. The sea spreading in every direction. The pirate world remains. This is the honest ending. Connor is dead, but the conditions that made Connor possible have not changed. There are other captains. There are other ships. There are other people who need someone with Ursel's particular expertise, whether for good or ill or some complicated combination. She carries Th with her. This is visible in the set of her jaw, in the way she looks at the water, not the calm look of someone at peace, but the look of someone who is moving forward anyway, which is different and perhaps harder. Grief is not resolved, especially not in a few months. It is absorbed. It becomes part of the weight you carry, and you learn to carry it, and you keep going. The theme of the film is exactly what it was stated to be, a woman who tried to outrun who she was, and realized some ghosts don't stay buried. But this is not a tragedy. Or not only a tragedy. Because who she was, the full, complicated person, is not only the violence and the loss. It is also the love. The decade of tending and building. The relationship with Th that was real and good even if it was built on a stolen foundation. The son she raised who, when the moment came, showed exactly the qualities she had spent years trying to give him. She could not keep the life she had. But what she was given, and what she built, and what she chose, those are not nothing. They are, in the end, what she takes with her. Bloody Mary. Ursel. Miriam. All the same person. All hers. All forward, on the water, under the Caribbean sky. He was standing near the edge of the square, speaking to two of his men, unhurried and calm as ever. He had not changed as much as she had hoped. He was older, certainly, but the essential quality of him, that cold, evaluating stillness, was exactly as she remembered it. She watched him for a long moment and she felt, alongside the fear and the anger, a clear-eyed recognition of what she was dealing with. This man had come here to destroy everything she had built. And he would do it, systematically and thoroughly, unless she stopped him. She began working her way back toward the cave. She had a plan, or the beginning of one. It was not a good plan, in the sense that it gave her high odds of survival. It was the best plan available given the circumstances, which was a different thing entirely. She was going to walk into Connor's camp. She came into the village openly, in the last hour of afternoon light, walking down the main path from the eastern approach with her hands visible and her pace unhurried. She had left her weapons with Elizabeth in the cave, not all of them, the ones she couldn't hide, but the obvious ones. She needed to appear as unthreatening as possible while being, in fact, extremely dangerous. Connor's men saw her first. There was a moment of alert scramble, hands moving to weapons, before Connor's voice cut through the noise with a single word. They stilled. He walked forward to meet her himself. They faced each other across 20 feet of packed earth in the village square, in the golden light of late afternoon, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Ursel looked at the man who had made her what she was, who had taken a lost girl and turned her into a weapon and deployed her for years without ever considering that weapons have interiority, that the thing being wielded has a perspective of its own, and she felt a complex tangle of emotion that she would not have been able to fully name. Not fear, exactly, though fear was part of it. Not simply anger, though anger was there too. Something older and more complicated. The specific feeling of being seen by someone who knew you in a way you wish they didn't. Connor looked at her and the corner of his mouth did something that might have been a smile. "Miriam," he said. She did not respond to the name. She had stopped being Miriam to him years ago. "Let them go," she said. "The people in the square. They have nothing to do with this. Let them go and I'll give you the gold." Connor tilted his head slightly, an evaluating gesture she remembered well. He was considering not the offer, he had already decided what he was going to do, but the reasoning behind it. Reading her. Cataloging the information in her face and posture. "The gold," he said. "Yes. I'd like my gold back." "All of it," she said. "I've kept it safe. It's in the caves. Let the village go and I'll take you to it." "You take me to it," he repeated. The slight emphasis on "take" communicated clearly that he understood the problems with this arrangement, that she knew the cave system and he didn't, that any guided approach would be on her terms. "I'll draw you a map," she said. "Detailed enough to find it without me. Let the people go first." He studied her for a moment longer. Then, "Where is your son?" The question was a knife. She didn't let it show. "Not here." "And your husband's sister?" "Not here." "And th?" The emphasis was gentle, almost conversational, but it landed where he intended it to land. She looked across the square to where th was bound. He was watching her with an expression that she could read from 30 feet, he was afraid, not for himself but for her, and that fear was covered over with the specific look of someone trying to tell her something without being able to speak it. She didn't know exactly what he was trying to tell her. She filed it away. "I see him," she said, keeping her voice level. "He has nothing to do with this either." "He's how I found you," Connor said pleasantly. "He does, in a way, have something to do with it." The negotiation continued for another half hour, circling and testing, each of them probing for information, neither willing to give more than they had to. Connor was, as he had always been, formidably skilled at this kind of thing, the calibrated exchange of information and leverage, the patient management of a situation toward a predetermined outcome. Ursel matched him as well as she could, buying time, assessing, watching the positions of his men around the square. What she was discovering, as the conversation went on, was something she had feared but needed to confirm. Connor was not primarily here for the gold. The gold was real, he wanted it, and he would take it, and she understood this. But the particular quality of his attention on her, the specific satisfaction in his manner, told her what she had already suspected. He had come for the pleasure of it. The pleasure of having found her after all these years.